Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, February 15th, and this is the 132nd day since the attacks by Hamas in South Israel, and since the war, or what the world is calling the war between Israel and Hamas, has begun, and since Israel's campaign in Gaza, cutting off food, water, electricity, their bombing campaign, and several weeks later, the ground incursion into Gaza began. News from the United States Office of Palestinian Affairs in Jerusalem. This is the office that used to be the consulate before the U.S. Embassy was moved to Jerusalem. But the U.S. Office of Palestinian Affairs reported on their Twitter account, or X account, forgive me, were devastated by the killing of 17-year-old U.S. citizen Mohammed Ahmad Khodor. The U.S. has no greater priority than the safety and security of our citizens. We urgently call for a quick, thorough, and transparent investigation, including full accountability. The Washington Post had reported that in the last 24 hours, 17-year-old U.S. citizen Mohammed Ahmad Khodor had been shot in the head by Israeli troops in Badou near Ramallah. The circumstances are unclear, but there were not clashes involved. According to several reports, the Israeli Defense Forces at the time of this video had yet to issue a comment. There was an extensive summary by Defense for Children International. The United States had previously issued a probe on a similar type situation. There was a previous killing of a teenager, Tawfiq Abdel-Jabbar, who was killed by Israeli forces after what were called clashes that apparently involved the throwing of stones at the end of January. Tawfiq Jabbar was also a U.S. citizen, as was Mohammed, and the U.S. called for a probe in the killing of Tawfiq. I don't have any updates about those specifics. Churches for Middle East Peace will be putting out a statement about this, but Mohammed was a senior in high school. He was a U.S. citizen, which shouldn't make any difference when there is indiscriminate killing, but maybe this is a case that we can use to motivate the U.S. government to respond. The area where he was killed is a wooded area. It's considered to be a park where many people from neighboring villages go to either pick mushrooms or sage or plants. 98 Palestinian children under the age of 18 have been killed in the occupied West Bank since October 7th. That's according to Defense for Children International Palestine. And when the Israeli military began a full-scale military offensive of the Gaza Strip, which the Gaza Strip campaign is called Operation Iron Swords, Israeli forces and settlers have killed 17 children, Palestinian children in the West Bank this year alone, 17 children between January and February 15th. 2 of those 17 Palestinian children were American citizens. And so I wanted to be sure to let you know. I'm sorry to always be summarizing tragic news. Another quick note related to the United States and Washington, D.C., an anti-boycott act passed in the House. It's unlikely that this is going to pass in the Senate, but I wanted to make sure that you're aware of this. This was by voice vote yesterday. It actually happened, or maybe that was on Tuesday, because it happened during our advocacy day. It's unlikely to move in the Senate, but it's important for us to pay attention to this. This is a bill that would make it illegal to essentially boycott Israel. It's one of some of the concerns that we have are the conflation of criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism, because we are ardently against anti-Semitism and want to raise awareness about that and educate about that and stand up against it. But American citizens should have the right to use economic leverage in whatever way they choose. And if that is to boycott settlement products or to boycott Israel, that's a right that we have in the United States because we're a democracy. Churches for Middle East Peace does not have a position on boycott. Some of our groups ardently support it. Some of our groups do not ardently support it. Some believe a limited boycott of settlement products is the right way to go. But we support the right to boycott. It is a fundamental principle of American democracy. Back in terms of updates, from on the ground, we did receive a report that on February 13th, a couple of days ago in South Hebron Hills, settlers were attacking shepherds. Sheep were running away, which means loss of livelihood. Settlers were also setting up tents in parts of the village. I'm sorry, this was not in the South Hebron Hills. This was actually in Wadi Fukin, a village near Bethlehem. So we got a report from Wadi Fukin on February 13th. I apologize, that's not the South Hebron Hills. That's in the area around Bethlehem. I wanted to take a few minutes today, and I'll go as quickly as possible, but I think this is so important. I wanted to summarize some principles that are behind the U.S. positions towards Gaza. They're called the Tokyo Principles. As the U.S. has approached the Middle East, there has been significant discord in the American approach and the approach of Arab governments. The U.S. has been focusing on the day after a permanent ceasefire, after there's a permanent ceasefire, after the war ends. And Arab counterparts in Arab nation states are unilaterally almost focused on immediate cessation of the ongoing war and the massive killings in Gaza. Discord was expressed about this. I mean, it has been since the beginning, but particularly in 2023 at an international dialogue that's called the Manama Dialogue. U.S. President sent their envoy to the Middle East. His name is Brett McGurk. He works mostly behind the scenes. McGurk met with Arab officials regarding points, priorities, and areas of concern about the Israel-Hamas war. And it's important to understand the Manama Dialogue is a unique forum for government ministers, policymakers, experts, opinion-forming business communities to debate the Middle East's most pressing foreign policy, defense, and security challenges. So just to note, these conversations were in mid-November. The last Manama Dialogue was in Bahrain, November 17th to 19th, 2023. There, McGurk presented what he called the 5 Tokyo Principles, not in reference to conditions imposed on Japan after its defeat with nuclear weapons in World War II, but rather as Blinken's post-G7 foreign ministers meeting in the Japanese capital. So it's not a reference to World War II. The 5 Tokyo Principles are foundational to the American approach right now in response to what's happening in Gaza. And we were reminded about this because they came up. I was talking about some of these principles, and the State Department officials actually talked about the 5 Tokyo Principles. And so I wanted to be sure to do the research and to share with you what that's all about. These principles are foundational to the United States government's approach. And this is the 5 principles, the 5 Tokyo Principles. No to the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. No to the reoccupation of Gaza, particularly the reoccupation by the Israeli government or military. No to the reduction of area and the land of Gaza. It's Palestinian land and it will remain Palestinian. No to the threat of Israel's security from Gaza, and no to the blockade of Gaza. That civilians must be isolated from Hamas, but they're not responsible for Hamas's crimes. Now, just to say, in general, Churches for Middle East Peace and our principles, we totally agree. No forced displacement. We support the legitimate security needs of Israel. No reoccupation of Gaza. Let's end the entire occupation, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Of course, the land should not be reduced. And the fact that the American government would say no to the blockade on Gaza, I hope they don't just mean the current blockade, but they mean the blockade that began 15, 16 years ago. Subsequently, McGurk articulated 5 guidelines for future actions, and these govern United States policies vis-a-vis Israel and the Hamas war. That the voice and aspirations of Palestinian people must be at the core to the governance in Gaza. That the West Bank and Gaza ought to revert to the authority of the Palestinian Authority, and that ensuring the security of Israel with no threat emanating from the West Bank and Gaza, furnishing support and resources for post-crisis and a transitional period to establish the groundwork for a 2-state solution, and establishing a mechanism for reconstruction and addressing the long-term needs of Gaza. For us to understand the U.S.'s approach to the current realities in Gaza, we cannot ignore these principles. For some, we fundamentally agree with the bare minimum required by international law, the no forced displacement, no reoccupation, no reduction of land. However, these principles ignore some of what Churches for Middle East Peace has been saying all along since October, and maybe even decades before these horrific attacks. The core issues of the conflict has to be addressed. You will never have a lasting peace until the occupation is brought to an end. The occupation of the Palestinian people in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, the time for it to end is now. If that is not brought to an end, full stop, the ending of the military control of those Palestinian populations in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, there will never be true security that's sought for Israelis. There will never be true peace between these two populations. So it's kind of like these 5 Tokyo principles are ignoring the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Gaza as if it's separate from the occupied Palestinian territories of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. To say that we want to establish the groundwork for a 2-state solution is also quite, forgive me, but it's ignorant. It ignores the history of the last 20 years, the abysmal failure of the Oslo Accords. There is no room for decades-long plans that promise peace in the future. Peace has to be diligently pursued in this moment now. It is the only option. And the way for that to begin is a comprehensive ceasefire. Let's not negotiate while people are dying. Palestinians are dying in Gaza every single day. And to not focus on the immediate cessation of massive deaths, what could be, according to the International Court of Justice, a genocide, is to ignore U.S. complicity and to ignore the most pressing problem in the Middle East, if not the world today. There was a very moving op-ed that Haaretz published by the son of the Israeli peace activist Vivian Silver. She was killed on October 7th, and I'll read portions of that in a future update. But he essentially says, "Who will take up my mother's mantle and call for peace?" He gives a desperate plea that the permanent, lasting, negotiated peace is the only way forward for Israelis to be safe and for Palestinians to be free.